As I may have mentioned before, Andrew became 80 in October, but you wouldn't credit it to look at him. He's very, very active, and he bikes all over the place. He can bicycle much faster than a lot of his younger relatives. And he actually recently competed in what's called the Etape Loch Ness, with his sons-in-law, Glenn and Graham, nephew Alexander, and cousin Robin Marjoribanks, son of Bob and Nancy Marjoribanks, who you may remember, Bob, who published the Marjoribanks letter for years, lived in Canada. This challenging 66-mile-long bicycle race starts and finishes in Inverness, but goes right round Loch Ness, over the Caledonian Canal, and back up a very, very hilly stretch to Inverness. Although our clan, Marjoribanks, is one of the smaller clans, it has a very long history and goes back to Philip Marjoribanks of that ilk in 1485. Andrew, our chief, is the 19th Marjoribanks of that ilk and has a longer line than found in many larger clans. He has an impressive coat of arms in heraldic terms with a crest coronet of 4 strawberry leaves and supporters which were granted because the Lord Lion King of Arms considers us to be what is called a considerable family. There are many places around Scotland where Marjoribanks links are found. There is the Marjoribanks farm in Dumfriesshire and Marjoribanks, although they actually pronounce it Marjoribanks Street, in Bathgate, both of which I have visited. The triumphal arch at Waterloo Place in Edinburgh shows the name of Sir John Marjoribanks, who was Lord Provost of Edinburgh. There is also the panelling in memory of my grandfather in Collington Church, and there are an awful lot of Marjoribankses buried in the graveyard there. In Coldstream, it's quite an imposing statue, Charles Marjoribanks, on the top. He was an MP, and Stuart will tell us more about his particulars. These places of family interest are listed by John Marjoribanks on the Marjoribanks website, and Andrew represents the clan as a member of the Standing Council of Scottish Chiefs and attends their meetings whenever they are held. They used to be held every year, but since COVID, that hasn't really happened, but hopefully we'll get back to that soon. We haven't had many family gatherings in Scotland recently, but I really am impressed with what you get up to here. We do nothing like it in Scotland. Absolutely amazing. And I mean, I'll be able to tell them back home, they've really got to step up a bit. That stall yesterday, it's beautiful, and all the careful preparation and the great welcome you've given us. We're really, really, truly grateful. In Britain, in Scotland, the UK Clan Marjoribanks Society last met at Edinburgh Castle, and that was really, really good fun. We all put on our kilts and our tartan, and we took part in the annual Edinburgh Royal Military Tattoo, wearing the Marjoribanks tartan. This spectacle is world famous, and quite often you can see it on the television. It's broadcast. Clans were asked to participate as part of the Scottish Government's homecoming year. About 40 Clan Marjoribanks supporters marched down from the castle to the castle esplanade, and we were welcomed by a 4-star general before the tattoo started. The previous general meeting of the UK Clan Marjoribanks Society was also held in Edinburgh. That same year, this was, I think, in 2014, not sure, Andrew and I unveiled a statue of a dog. You might wonder why. This was a golden retriever developed as a breed by Dudley Marjoribanks, or Lord Tweedmouth, at his estate in Giesecke in the Scottish Highlands. Once again, I would like to thank you so much for this wonderful reception you have given us. We are truly grateful, and it's lovely that so many of my immediate family were here, and my second cousin, Gillian. Thank you very much. And Caroline, this is a tiny, tiny Scottish gift.
You can share it if you want to. My hobby is DNA genealogy, and I've recently become helping James Green Thirdler with the Marjoribanks Genealogy DNA project. Patricia and I had a visit a couple of years ago from Father Chris Latham over there from South Carolina, and as I'm sure you know, Chris is found via DNA to have a Marjoribanks ancestor and was visiting Marjoribanks sites in Scotland with local tour guide Andy Marjoribanks. We're gratified that the Big Y DNA has conclusively proven that the Junior Lee's Marjoribanks branch is connected to the chiefs and Patricia's senior Marjoribanks. We really encourage more Marjoribanks men to take a Y DNA test so that we can identify the origin of more Marjoribanks lines. I've got something to give here to James Green. It's a prize. That's recognition of all the work we've done here. Once again, that's the family tree that I given to James. And you can't see it because it's far too small over there. But right at the top was Philip Marjoribanks, who is the earliest ancestor that we can find. And my guess is that Philip Marjoribanks came from a town of Kirkpatrick Juxta in the borders of Scotland, because there were quite a lot of records of Marjoribanks in that town. And I think what probably happened was people there took their name from a farm called Marjoribanks, from Marjoribanks Farm. The Marjoribanks Farm, incidentally, was called, was spelled Marjoribanks, but recently it's changed to Marjoribanks, M-A-R-C-H. Okay, so that shows you Patricia on the right and Andrew on the left. Andrew is the chief and Patricia is his first cousin. Actually, if you go further over, that's Jane Marjoribanks, and that's the mother of Gillian here. So there are two lines, well-known lines of Marjoribanks ancestors. The one on the left, the blue one on the left, is the Marjoribanks ancestor of Patricia and Gillian and the chief. And it's called the senior line, Marjoribanks of Marjoribanks of Marjoribanks of the Hill. The one on the right is a younger brother, and called James, I think. And normally we call that the junior line, or Marjoribanks of Lees. Okay, so these are the different topics I'm going to go through, 7 different topics. So, once again, where did the Marjoribanks tree come from? In 1673, there was a public register by law in Scotland. Before that, anybody could have a coat of arms without any justification. But in 1673, you had just to register your coat of arms, had to register your name and your family with the Lord Lion King of Arms in Edinburgh. We saw one of his representatives yesterday at the Galway. So that was the coat of arms that Thomas Marjoribanks of that Ilk registered in 1673. And Marjoribanks of ill. The tree was registered by Thomas Marjoribanks, but it went into abeyance. Nobody followed up on that. And Patricia's grandfather started to look to try to connect his Marjoribanks name with that Marjoribanks in 1673. And Patricia's uncle, father of the present chief, continued that and eventually convinced the Lord Lion King of Arms that we, Patricia, Andy and so on, were all descended along the Marjoribanks of Ilk. The Marjoribanks of Lees, at the same date, in 1673, Joseph Marjoribanks of Leuchie registered his arms and family tree with the Lord Lion. His line died out, but another line of that same Marjoribanks family registered as Marjoribanks of Lees in 1773. So that is what we call Marjoribanks of Lee, or a junior line. And that was the one that was registered with the Lord Lion, the junior line of Marjoribanks. Incidentally, junior line sounds like it's a minor line, but in fact, the people that were in that line are much more important than Patricia's line. For country parsons, whereas the Marjoribanks of Lees have got bankers, they were titled, they had money. Right. Christian Marjoribanks is a relative of, again, Patricia's line, and this Christian Marjoribanks married a man called George Heriot in 1586. And George Heriot was a moneylender, well, he was a jeweller, goldsmith, and the moneylender to the crown. And he was very wealthy. And he was reputed to walk along the streets of Edinburgh with his pockets full of gold, jingling full of gold. That's why he was called Jingling Geordie. Anyway, George Heriot founded a school called George Heriot School. George Heriot, as I say, married Christian Marjoribanks, relatives of Patricia and Julian's, and that's the school that George Heriot built. And the person on the right there is our granddaughter, Olivia. And she was at the school several years ago. She was only 5 years old, and they had a Founders' Day celebration. And she was brought out as an ancestor, a descendant of the founder's wife. So that can show all the boys and girls in primary 1B. So one of the questions I've been asked sometimes is, did the Marjoribanks of Ilk, have a great country house or castle that they lived in? And the answer is yes. They had a house called Balbardie House in Bathgate. The architect was Robert Adams, which is one of Scotland's most famous architects at that time. It had 100 acres of ground right about it, and it was said to be Robert Adams' finest classical house in Scotland. That's it there, that's another drawing or painting of it, Balbardie House. So, what happened to Balbardie House? Why don't we have Balbardie House? And the answer is Alexander Marjoribanks. He travelled in America, Australia, New Zealand, and he, I'm afraid, spent all the money, wine, woman and song, and he had to sell off the house to pay for his debts. And soon after he sold off the house, coal was found underneath the house. And in those days, coal was sort of the equivalent of finding oil nowadays, you know. He would have made a lot of money. Oops, I've done it again. How do I get out of that?
It's okay.
If he had kept the house.
Press the left to go forward.
Okay. Anyway, the house was sold to a school, which is today Daniel Stewart College. So that is the remnants. That's what's left of Balbardie House. It fell down, and the top is the Bathgate Leisure Centre, and the bottom is Balbardie Park Golf Course on the grounds of Balbardie House. And that is the school that got all the money from the Balbardie House In fact, I went to that school. But anyway, you can see where all the money went. A magnificent edifice for all that money that we should have had. And that's one of his books, Alexander Marjoribanks, the one that spent all the money. Now, in that family tree there, down at the bottom, you can see Charles MP. He is the one I'm going to go on to next. That's his statue, statue in Coldstream, and that's another view of it near the Tweed River. And recently, a few years ago, Sir John Swinton, Lord Lieutenant of Berwickshire, said in Coldstream was a statue of former MP Charles Marjoribanks. So I wasn't a nobody. Anyway, his brother, Charles David Marjoribanks, is that one there next to him. He was the younger brother of Charles Marjoribanks, and he married a rich woman, obviously a useful thing to do. He married Sarah Haggerston, who had lots of money, and her mother remarried too, and she had even more money in lands, the Robertsons. And so in order to keep the land and the money, he changed his name from David Marjoribanks to David Robertson. Anyway, he was a noble, as they say, and he called himself Lord Marjoribanks. There he is, David Lord Marjoribanks. The only thing is that 6 days after he was ennobled, he was run over by a horse-drawn bus in the north of England, and he died. It's one of the shortest peers in history. So that's a sad story of David Lord Marjoribanks. Patricia mentioned also Dudley Marjoribanks had a house in Scotland, north of Scotland, called Giesecke. That photo you can't really see very well, but in the back that's kind of the wreck of the rubble of the remains of his house. And he bred the first what they called golden retrievers at Giesecke. And this is a statue that was put up by the Golden Retriever Club of Britain in the United States. So that's Andy Marjoribanks with his hand in the dog, Patricia next to him, and the lady next to him, I think she's called Kay.
No, Joy.
Joy, sorry.
Joy's on it.
She's the chairman of the American Golden Retriever Club. And these are some of the golden retrievers.
So they're lovely dogs.
Yeah. And my last story is James Marjoribanks. And he is, he's actually a half nephew of Roger Marjoribanks, who was a genealogist, and he's a brother of David Marjoribanks, who's the main representative of the House of Lees. Anyway, so there you can see Patricia, and there James Marjoribanks on the right in the view. So anyway, James went to university at Exeter University in England, and he did a Bachelor of Education degree. And when he was doing that degree, he took a course in comparative education. And part of that was an exchange program with Hungary. He says he actually took the course because he wanted to get out of university 3 weeks early. Anyway, while he was there, he met a nice girl, Erika. So they only spent a few days together. And James had to return to do his exams. And so they continued to write letters backwards and forwards. It took 3 weeks to get a letter over there and back again. Erika got a scholarship to study in South America, and they lost touch. Anyway, Erika and James met up again after a bit of research. James managed to find her telephone number, and so he traveled to Hungary, and they spent a lovely 3 weeks together, and then he came back, and they lost touch. James married a lady called Julie Le Patoureau in 1992, and they had 2 children, Sophie and Angus. James became a schoolmaster and eventually headmaster of a primary school, and they divorced in 2001. But James never forgot Erika. So James wondered frequently about Erika. He imagined the life she was living, and the special love that they had in their hands. And he searched the internet without success. He wondered what would happen. Would it happen? What would he ever say to her if he ever managed to get in contact with her? And on Sunday in 2014, he found McCladdy, Erika, I think, in Hungary, the surname and Christian name were transposed in Budapest in an esoteric website, they called it, with a telephone number. So it was an unusual name, McCladdy. So he wrestled with himself what to do. So she was beautiful, probably happily married, probably had 3 gorgeous child kids that they talked about back in 1992. How dare he be so arrogant as to think that she still held a candle for him? Wasn't he risking playing with her emotions? So he plucked up courage. After laughter, what of heart-sinking and with a Dutch courage, he called the number. He assumed that since it was a work number, he would just leave a message, and the workplace would be closed on Sunday. So dialed the number, someone answered. McCladdy, Erika, he obviously speaks some Hungarian. There was silence for a minute, and then the voice disappeared. A new voice came on and said, "Hello, Erika?" "Oh, hi, it's James." "James?" "Yes, James Marjoribanks." "James, yes." I remember him. And he seemed surprised, happy, question mark. So after a long telephone conversation, during which they recounted what had happened to them in the intervening 22 years, they found they each had 2 children, and it took quite a bit to find out they were both divorced because they were too scared to be asked. So £250 worth of phone calls later, and 3 weeks later, James was on a flight to Hungary. I took this as an article from the Exeter's Alumni Club, and this is what he's written. 3rd time lucky, yes, 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 yes. They got married in Greece and in England at Harrogate, and they enjoyed a wonderful time ever since. James retired from his job as a headmaster, and they relocated to Western Hungary where they bought a house. So this is on the left, James and Erika getting married in Greece, in an island in Greece, and the photo on the right is them getting married in Harrogate. So that's it.